Picture this. A knight in gleaming armor charges fiercely across a battlefield, shouting at the top of his lungs, completely alone against a sea of foes. This is how many people picture Crusader warfare. But the truth was far more calculated, disciplined, and ruthless than any movie has ever shown. Today, we're diving into the blood-soaked reality of how Crusaders truly fought their battles in the medieval world. When you imagine Crusader combat, ignore everything you've watched on screen. These weren't reckless fighters charging blindly into death. They were methodical, structured fighting machines who knew that survival depended on discipline, not personal heroics. An Arabian warrior named Usama ibn Monk, who actually fought against the Crusaders, complained about his enemies in a way that might shock you. He said, "Of all men, the Franks are the most careful in warfare. Careful, not bold, not fierce, but careful." That reveals something vital about how these clashes really unfolded. The hidden weapon of Crusader forces wasn't bravery or religious passion alone. It was the shock charge, a devastating tactical strike that demanded incredible coordination and timing. Picture hundreds of heavily armored knights storming across a battlefield in flawless formation, their lances lowered in unison like a moving wall of death. But here's what makes this horrifying. It only worked if every single rider held their position. One knight breaking formation could ruin the entire charge and turn victory into disaster. These weren't lone warriors chasing glory. They were tactical squads called conroys, small groups of knights who trained together, fought together, and often perished together. Multiple conroys would merge to form larger battalions, building a military force that could adapt to almost any battlefield challenge. The proof of their skill lies in one of the most astonishing military achievements in medieval history. When Crusader forces first faced Muslim horse archers, they encountered a completely foreign form of combat. These mounted enemies would pour arrows down on them while staying just out of reach, a tactic that had crushed countless armies before. But instead of collapsing under this pressure, the Crusaders did something remarkable. They studied Byzantine war tactics and successfully copied them on their very first attempt. This wasn't chance or panic. This was the work of highly trained, sharp military professionals who understood that adaptation meant survival. Now, let's discuss what these warriors actually carried into battle, because the reality was far more harsh than any costume designer could create. A typical Crusader soldier during the First Crusade wore a coat covered in metal scales sewn to leather or cloth. Over this went a chainmail shirt with long sleeves, handguards, and a collar that could mean the difference between life and death. On his head sat a cone-shaped helmet strapped with leather ties, often featuring a nose guard that gave him the look of some armored bird of prey. But here's where things get unusual. This gear, designed for European battles, was completely unsuitable to the burning heat of the Middle East. Imagine marching across desert sand while wearing what was basically a metal oven. The Crusaders quickly learned to adapt, switching to lighter chainmail and adding cotton-quilted caps under their helmets to handle the brutal sun. The weight of this gear tells its own story. A fully armed Crusader carried so much metal that quick movement became nearly impossible. Their heavy broadswords, lances, and armor-produced warriors who could devastate foes in close combat, but struggled with speed and endurance. This meant that every battle turned into a race against time. Could they clash with the enemy before exhaustion kicked in? Could they hold their formations while burdened down like pack animals? Archaeological evidence from medieval battlefields uncovers something vital about where these warriors aimed their weapons. Excavations at sites like the Battle of Tun show that most fighters died from multiple brutal head wounds. This makes perfect sense when you consider medieval armor. Since chainmail and plate guarded the torso, the head became the main target. Stepping onto a medieval battlefield without a helmet was practically suicide, which is why even the poorest soldiers found ways to shield their skulls. But single combat was only part of the Crusader military system. These armies faced a challenge that would push every aspect of their organization: siege warfare. Unlike the fast, decisive field battles we watch in films, most Crusader campaigns centered around the slow, grinding process of capturing fortified cities. Consider the siege of Acre during the Third Crusade, a vicious affair that lasted nearly 2 years. The city was surrounded by massive battlements and guarded by towers that seemed to scrape the sky. When the Crusader army of God Lusignan arrived, they didn't instantly assault the walls. Instead, they did something that shows the careful nature of medieval warfare. They dug in. The Crusaders ringed Acre with their own fortifications, building ditches and moats that turned the siege into a city within a city. They understood that capturing a fortified position demanded patience, engineering, and overwhelming resources. When reinforcements came from the west, they brought not only fresh troops, but the supplies needed to build colossal siege engines. The French contingent tunneled beneath one of Acre's great towers, a process that took months of dangerous underground effort. Meanwhile, other Crusaders built catapults so huge they gave them names. The French called one of their siege engines God's own sling, a weapon capable of hurling stones heavy enough to smash fortress walls. But the true key to Crusader victory at Acre wasn't their siege weapons or their bravery. It was logistics. While Saladin's army tried desperately to shatter the siege from outside, Crusader ships kept arriving with provisions, reinforcements, and ammunition. The Muslims found themselves trapped between the city's defenders and the Crusaders' siege lines, unable to properly support either side. This brings us to perhaps the most crucial aspect of Crusader warfare that no film has ever truly shown: the absolutely vital role of supply lines and logistics. Medieval Europe had lost the Roman mastery of military logistics centuries earlier, and Crusader armies had to rediscover these lessons in the harsh deserts of the Middle East. The reality was harsh and unforgiving. An army could carry roughly a week's worth of food for the soldiers, but nothing for the horses and pack animals. These beasts needed 4 to 6 hours of grazing every single day, which meant that every march had to be organized around finding enough grass and water. Many Crusader armies were broken not by enemy blades, but by empty stomachs and poisoned wells. Muslim leaders like Saladin understood this weakness perfectly and used it as their most lethal weapon. When Richard the Lionheart arrived in the Holy Land during the Third Crusade, he brought something that set him apart from earlier Crusader leaders: careful planning. While earlier armies had starved in the desert, Richard arranged for supply ships to shadow his forces as they marched along the coast. His success came not from better fighting skills, but from superior organization. But Saladin was equally brilliant at this dangerous game of logistics. When Richard, finally attempting to march inland toward Jerusalem, he realized that the Muslim commander had deliberately destroyed everything in his path. Wells were tainted, crops scorched, livestock driven away. The countryside had been turned into a desolate wasteland where an army could only last 4 days before collapsing from starvation. This forced Richard into one of the hardest decisions of his military career. Despite having one of the best supplied and most disciplined forces of the entire Crusader era, he understood that besieging Jerusalem would mean watching his men perish slowly of hunger and thirst. The two greatest military leaders of their generation had essentially stalemated each other through logistics alone. The contrast with Muslim military organization was striking and often decisive. While Crusader forces struggled with supply lines stretched across endless miles, Muslim armies operated with advanced logistics networks, using thousands of camels and mules. These supply trains carried not only food and weapons, but physicians and medical tools, giving Muslim forces a vital advantage in the harsh wars of attrition that defined Crusader conflicts. But what happened when all the planning, all the logistics, and all the tactical strategies finally came together in real combat? Recent archaeological finds have given us a grim window into the reality of medieval battle. At Saladin Castle in Lebanon, Archaeologists uncovered the remains of soldiers who died during the 13th century assaults on the fortress. These weren't clean deaths from Hollywood's sword duels. The skeletons tell a story of sheer brutality that no movie has ever dared to show. Some bodies bore sword cuts across the backs of their necks, suggesting they were captives executed by decapitation after the battle had ended. Others had been struck down from behind while fleeing, their spines shattered by pursuing enemies. These weren't glorious warrior deaths. They were the frantic final moments of young men who realized their formations had collapsed and death was unavoidable. The wounds covering these medieval fighters reveal something vital about Crusader combat. When disciplined formations collapsed, when the careful tactical planning failed, medieval warfare turned into a chaotic massacre where survival often depended more on chance than skill. This archaeological evidence destroys one of the most lasting myths about Crusader warfare. These weren't lone champions dueling enemy heroes, while armies waited respectfully on the sidelines. Real medieval combat was a desperate struggle, where fighters targeted the weakest points on their opponent's bodies with ruthless precision. The Crusader military system succeeded not because of individual bravery or religious zeal, but because of systematic organization, careful planning, and ruthless efficiency. The myth about Crusader warfare isn't found in tales of individual valor or divine miracles. It's found in the detailed records of supply manifests, the calculated placement of siege engines, and the grim archaeological evidence of what happened when medieval military science collided with the brutal realities of combat. Story. Remember the poisoned wells and the careful supply routes. Remember the shock charges that demanded perfect coordination and the siege engines with names like God's own sling. Remember the young warriors whose bones still carry the marks of wounds they suffered 800 years ago. That's how Crusaders truly fought. And now you know the truth behind the legend.